Did you know that you can walk around the Temple Mount today that Jesus and the apostles walked around on? That's pretty cool. Stick around, let me tell you about it. So first of all, let's talk about the Temple Mounts, the temples, and the fortresses of the Temple Mount. We'll go through this pretty quickly. So as this morning we talked about the valleys of Jerusalem, we talked about the mountains of Jerusalem. The main mountain of Jerusalem, Mount Moriah. That's where the temple stood. That's where the Dome of the Rock stands today. The Temple Mount is on Mount Moriah. The Temple Mount of today is the Herodian Temple Mount. It was the third of three Temple Mounts. You can go walk where Jesus walked. You can go walk where the apostles walked. That's kind of cool. We did that when we were in Israel several years ago. Currently, the Muslim Dome of the Rock is on the very tippy top of Mount Moriah. If you go in the Dome of the Rock, if you're a Muslim, you can see the very top of Mount Moriah. I'll show you a picture of that as we go on in the lesson. So there are three Temple Mounts, three temples. They weren't all necessarily, they didn't line up with each other necessarily. And then there were a bunch of fortresses, 7 fortresses on the Temple Mount. So this is Jerusalem today. We talked about Jerusalem, the city, in our class this morning. Tonight we're going to talk about this chunk in yellow right here, the Temple Mount, about 37 acres worth. In Old Testament times, we had Solomon's temple. Everybody, the kids knew the answer to this, right? Solomon's temple was the first temple. Everybody knows Solomon built the first temple. And it was a fairly small, simple place. It was built in 967 and 960 BC, and built on the spot that David bought. He bought the threshing floor of Aruna for 50 shekels of silver and bought the entire mountain for 600 shekels of gold a little bit later on. 142,000 animals were sacrificed on the Temple Mount on the day of the dedication, or the week of the dedication of the temple. 142,000 animals. Wrap your head around that. And also remember that number as we go on, because we're going to compare that number, 142,000, to some other number as we go further in the lesson tonight. And this temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 587 BC. There is also a square Temple Mount. We don't know who built it. Maybe Solomon, maybe as late as the rule of Hezekiah. But the square Temple Mount was 500 cubits on each side, which is 861 feet. That's kind of interesting because we'll see things on today's Temple Mount that you can go see that are traced back to Solomon's Temple Mount. That's pretty cool. So you can go up there and see these things. I will show you that in just a minute. So we don't know who did it. Lean Rittenmeyer, who's kind of the guru, he wrote a book called The Quest. I took a lot of the information from my book out of his book, of course, reference to his book. But if you're interested in the nitty-gritty details of the temple, the temples, and the Temple Mount, and the current things on the Temple Mount, even down to the caves and the cisterns and that kind of thing, get his book called The Quest. But he thinks that the Temple Mount, the square Temple Mount, was built by Hezekiah during his reign. Now, if I go to the Temple Mount today, there's this step at the bottom of the Muslim raised platform. The Muslim raised platform was built when the Dome of the Rock was built, I think, in the 600s, late 600s AD. So relatively speaking, not that long ago, right? 1,500 years ago, whatever. But this Muslim platform is lined up with the western wall of Herod's Temple Mount. And that makes sense. Archaeologically, aesthetically, you want walls to line up, right? You don't want crooked walls in your house and whatever. So when they built this platform, they lined up this edge with the western wall, which is over here, of the Temple Mount. But this step is not lined up with that wall. Why? I'll tell you why. This step is exactly 500 cubits from the eastern wall of the Temple Mount, of the current Temple Mount. The eastern wall of the Temple Mount was shared by Solomon's Temple Mount, the square Temple Mount, the Hasmonean Temple Mount we'll talk about in a few minutes, and then the Herodian Temple Mount. That same wall was shared by all three Temple Mounts. This step is lined up with that wall. That probably is the top of the wall of Solomon's Temple Mount, of the square Temple Mount. And you go stand on that today. Kind of cool. But again, it's not lined up with the edge of the Muslim platform. And I'll show you an upper view of that here in just a minute. So next up, the Tower of Hananel. Now, I'm not going to talk about the towers and the fortresses a lot, but as you read the Bible, and you come across terms for, in this case, the Tower of Hananel. You'll read about that in Jeremiah and Zechariah. I want you to be familiar with the terminology. All the forts of the Temple Mount were typically built on this northwestern corner. Remember this morning we talked about Jerusalem, how defensible it was on the eastern, western, and southern sides? Well, same with the Temple Mount. It was pretty defensible on these sides, but it was not defensible on this northern side. So the towers were typically built on the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. And we read about this in Jeremiah and Zechariah. This tower was likely destroyed when the temple was destroyed in 587. Between 587 and 535 BC, there was nothing up there except rubble. Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Babylonians, came in and destroyed everything in 587 BC, like the Romans did later on in 70 AD. Turns out Nebuchadnezzar destroyed on the same day that the Romans destroyed the temple, just a bunch of years apart. It's called Tisha B'Av. Tisha B'Av, 9th of Av. Their Jewish month of Av is the saddest day in Jewish history because the temple was destroyed in 587 and it was destroyed in 70 AD, same day of their Jewish calendar. They go by lunar calendar, whereas we go by solar calendar. If you're interested in the kind of thing, you can go to my website and you can convert between these two different calendars in one of the calculators that I have there. Zerubbabel's temple. As we talked about this morning in the history lead up to all this that we're talking about tonight, we talked about at the end of the Old Testament was a renaissance for the Jews. Nehemiah had come back and rebuilt the wall of Jerusalem, right? Zerubbabel had come back and rebuilt the temple of Jerusalem. Ezra had rediscovered the law, and the Jews were kind of like a renaissance kind of thing. They were under the protection and auspices of the Persian government. Cyrus started out by letting them come back. He gave them money to come back, and then all the Persian kings continued that tradition on down through the years. Everything was good for the Jews, right? So Zerubbabel came back and built the temple, the second temple, which had been destroyed in 587 BC. He started in 535, completed 20 years later in 515 BC. There were 712 animals sacrificed during this temple dedication, compared to, what's the number? 142,000 versus 712. Many of the old people who had seen the first house, Solomon's temple and its foundations, wept with a loud voice. Zerubbabel's temple was not anything like Solomon's temple. I mean, just look at the difference in the dedication of the animals. It was good to have a temple, but it wasn't like the good old days. We talk about that, don't we? The good old days. Well, same thing for them. The good old days was when the temple existed under Solomon. There's a bunch of stuff in the temple that was no longer there. The Ark of the Covenant that was in the Holy of Holies, no longer there. The cherubim, no longer there. Some of the vessels, Cyrus, if he had them, he allowed them to come back to Jerusalem. But the Ark of the Covenant disappeared. We don't know where it went. I guess go watch Raiders of the Lost Ark and find out. Next up, the Towers of Hananel and the 100. We'll read about these in Nehemiah, located on the same northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. During the Intertestament, we have another fortress called the Ptolemaic Akra. Again, some of these fortresses were just kind of like rebuilding, rededicating, renaming. So same thing here. The Ptolemaic Akra, only because the Ptolemies, remember the history from this morning? The Ptolemies controlled Jerusalem and Cold Syria during this time. So when they controlled it, they named their fort the Ptolemaic Akra. Next up, the Seleucid Akra. Now I just told you, and you're thinking I'm lying to you, but I just told you that these three sides were very defensible and this side was not. That's why the fortresses were always built on the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount. Why did the Seleucids build a fortress on the southern end of the Temple Mount? Well, the reason was it wasn't a fortress to keep people out, it was a fortress to watch the Jews. This fortress was built higher than the Temple Mount, it was built higher than the lower city, it was built higher than the upper city. The Seleucids could stand in their Seleucid fortress and look down on the Jews, and the Jews didn't like this a bit. It was a thorn in their side. Next up, when the Hasmoneans took over, remember the history? The Maccabees came and under Papa Mattathias and Judas Maccabeus the Hammer. They in the Maccabean revolt, and then the Hasmoneans. During the Hasmonean dynasty, the Hasmonean Bears came about. Basically the Ptolemaic Akra, they just kind of took it over and renamed it. But you will read about that in the Intertestament history. And then the Seleucid Akra was destroyed by the Maccabees. It was a thorn in their side, right? So they got rid of it. So the easiest thing to do, when I go and remodel my house, I have to either put a little bit in the trash can at a time or take it out to the street and they'll come get it or whatever. Back in the day, what did you do with all the rubble when you destroyed something? Well, the Hasmoneans decided to dump it into this new extension of the Temple Mount they made. So this extension was the Hasmonean extension built from rubble of the Seleucid Akra. Kind of cool. Next up, the first Antonia fortress. Herod the Great took over Jerusalem in 37 BC, and he enhanced really the fortress that was there. So remember, it was the Hasmonean barracks. When Herod the Great took over, he renamed it the Antonia fortress after his benefactor Mark Antony of Rome. Okay, and notice that it's built on the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount, the square Temple Mount again. Okay. In New Testament times, everything changed. We have a new temple. Herod the Great built this temple. Herod the Great was a smart guy. And you can argue with me all day about how bad he was. Yes, he was a bad guy. He was an evil man, but he was smart. He was politically brilliant. And one thing he did when he decided to build this temple is he promised that I'm going to build you a temple. He would tell the Jews this. He would tell the priests this. I'm going to build you a temple. And they would say, yeah, but what if you don't? What if you're just talking big? And what if you're really not going to build a temple? He said, I'll tell you what. I'm going to pay for it with my own money. He's very rich, obviously. I'll pay for it with my own money, and I will gather all the supplies ahead of time, and I will park them on the Temple Mount up there, and I will train 1,000 of you priests to be able to build this temple. Before we even start doing a thing, we're going to do all that. I'm going to get the supplies, I'm going to pay for them, and I'm going to train you to build. And the priest said, okay, good plan, let's go along with that. And they did. So this really is kind of the third temple, but it's really named the second temple because it really is just it's like remodeling your house. It was a pretty major remodeling, but it's really the Zerubbabel's temple with a new facelift, right? But it was a very impressive facelift that Herod the Great did. Next up, Herod decided to do his own Temple Mount expansion. He extended the walls to the north, the west, and the south. If you go to Jerusalem today and you want to see where these Temple Mounts are, you can find them. You can see those very easily. If I stand on the top, and I didn't do this, I've just read about it, but if you stand on the top of the Temple Mount wall and look down the wall, you'll see that there's a little bend in the wall. And that's where the Hasmonean extension begins. Now, that's not the current stones that are on the Temple Mount today, but they're down in the foundation. When they built new stones upon old stones, and then new stones upon old stones, and they got destroyed and whatever. So this all goes down to the foundation. But there's that little 1.12 degree bend in the wall there. That's a delineation between where the Hasmoneans built their temple extension from where the square Temple Mount was. For Herod's Temple Mount, there's something called the seam. You can actually go up to that today and you can touch it. You can see it. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. Also notice that the gates line up. Herod's Temple Mount gates line up directly with the Hasmonean gates and the Solomon era gates, the square Temple Mount gates. Same thing for the triple gate. You can go see those gates today. You walk up the southern stairs of the Temple Mount to the Temple Mount, and you can see those gates today. They're blocked in, but you can see where the gates were, the big double gate and the big triple gate over here. Pretty cool. Those gates, if they were not blocked in, you would be able to walk through those and walk through the Hasmonean gate, you'd be underground basically, and then you'd pop out on top of the Temple Mount where the old gates were of Solomon's Temple Mount, of the square Temple Mount. The gate names shown here are modern-ish names. Back in the 1800s, when the British controlled Palestine, they sent all kinds of explorers out. And they were able to dig around in the good old days. We can't do that today on the Temple Mount. We can't dig around up there. But they were able to dig around, and they would go underground and explore. And they found all these gates. There's Warren's Gate, Wilson's Arch, Barclay's Gate, Robinson's Arch. I'm going to show you some of these pictures of these things that exist today when you go to Jerusalem. The eastern gate over here is the only one, and again, it's not the original stones, but it's the only gate that is shared, at least down to the foundation, for all three Temple Mounts. All the rest of the gates were covered up by extensions, right? Herod's extension covered everything else up except for the eastern wall of Solomon's, of the square Temple Mount. The second Antonia fortress was built by Herod, again, named after his benefactor Mark Antony of Rome, on the extended Herodian Temple Mount on the northwest corner, like every other fortress was. Now, if you go to Jerusalem today and tromp around on the Temple Mount, you can. You go through one gate, you're allowed to go through, the Mughrabi gate, and you go up there and tromp around the Temple Mount. Where you're tromping is the Herodian Temple Mount. That area that is up there is the same as what Herod built 2,000 years ago. That's kind of cool when you go do that. The temple? No. Not in modern times. There is no temple in modern times. This today is the Dome of the Rock. It is a Muslim institution. It's a Muslim shrine. It's not a mosque. The mosque is right here. It's called the Al-Aqsa Mosque. But the shrine, the Dome of the Rock, sits over the foundation stone, the very tippy top of Mount Moriah. You can't go in there. We tried. I told you this morning, the little guy in the chair sitting outside said, no, you can't go in. You have to be Muslim to go into the shrine, the Dome of the Rock. And when I was writing the book, I had trouble finding pictures of what the top of the rock looked like, but I did finally find one and put it in the book. But as you look at this wall of the Temple Mount, we see the bend right here. And again, you can't see that in the stonework. You can't see because it's all interwoven, but it's down to the foundation. But you see the little bend right here. So to the right of that bend is Solomon era foundation. In between here is Hasmonean era foundation. And to the left is Herodian era foundation and stones. You can actually see Hasmonean stones here at the bend, at the seam rather, and you can see Herodian stones at the other end of the seam. Right here is the seam. Herodian masonry over here, Hasmonean masonry over here. You can go up and touch that if you want to. Nobody's ever there. I mean, you just go up and do whatever you want to on the outside of the Temple Mount walls. They don't care too much about what goes on down at the bottom of the Temple Mount. They do care a lot about what goes on the Temple Mount. The Muslims are very strict about how they let you behave up there. This is a picture of what the southwest corner of the Temple Mount looked like back in the day, back in Jesus' day. There was a giant staircase that went up from the lower city of Jerusalem to the royal stoa on the south side of the Temple Mount. This arch, these stones coming out, is called Robinson's Arch. Edward Robinson found those in the 1800s, the late 1800s. I don't remember exactly when. But we can see those today, and I'll show you a picture of those here in just a minute. So these stones, you know, they carried the weight of this giant staircase that went up here. Also over here we have Barclay's Gate. All the gates, all the ancient gates are all covered up. They're all stoned in because they're not used anymore. Barclay's Gate, you can go, if you're a woman, you can go up and touch Barclay's Gate where it is, because it is in the women's prayer area of the Western Wall. If you're a man, not so much. But if you're a man, you can go over here and you can see Wilson's Arch. Women can't see that one. So, you know, we kind of get, it's kind of fair one way or the other, I guess. So anyway, notice on this southern wall down here, this staircase. You can't see it in the picture, but there are arches under the staircase where there were merchants, you know, selling animals, maybe doing money changing, I don't know, whatever was going on down there. But just keep that in mind. On the southern wall of the Temple Mount, there's these arches under this stairway. And this stairway goes up to the double and triple gates. You can go up the double and triple gates today, and again, they're filled in. You can't go through them, but you can see where they were. The Temple Mount in AD 70. Nothing. Like the Temple Mount after Nebuchadnezzar came along, the Romans were brutal. They didn't just destroy things, they leveled everything. They pushed all the stones off the Temple Mount onto the street below. The Jews, after the Six-Day War, excavated down to the Roman street. This is it. Everyone, when they go to Jerusalem and Israel, they have kind of a different experience. You know, some people, they go out on the Sea of Galilee on a boat, and they think that's the neat experience for me. For me, it was kind of going on the Temple Mount and standing where the porch of the temple likely was, and just wandering around the Temple Mount, just kind of like, that was really cool to me. Shelley, her thing was walking on this street. She said, you know, that street could be where Jesus and the apostles walked. That's pretty cool. Well, the Jews, when they excavated after the war, they excavated down to the street here, but they decided to leave all the boulders from the Temple Mount above that the Romans pushed over the wall. It was total destruction. This is Robinson's Arch right here. Hard to see, I know. So this woman is standing pretty much on the southwest corner of the Temple Mount in front of Robinson's Arch, and then we see the various gates up there. The Temple Mount today, it's known as the Haram al-Sharif. It's a Muslim-controlled piece of land. As I mentioned this morning, it's controlled by the Muslim Waqf. The Waqf is under the auspices of the Jordanian government. They control civilly what goes on the Temple Mount. The Jews, the Israelis, have security control on the Temple Mount. As I mentioned this morning, if you go to the Temple Mount today, you need to plan around it. The hours are very limited, but you don't wear shorts. Women, you need to cover your shoulders, probably your head. You don't hold hands. You certainly don't kiss your spouse. You don't pray. You don't carry a Bible. There's a lot of things you need to be aware of if you go to the Temple Mount. You can go. It's completely safe. Well, it's mostly safe to go, depending on the time of year or the time of the whatever wars are going on or whatever. But it's a pretty safe place to go. You just need to follow the rules when you do go. You know, don't do those things and some others that I'm not remembering right now. But the current Temple Mount today has the Dome of the Rock, the gold dome Muslim shrine. It has the Muslim raised platform. Notice the purple Muslim raised platform is parallel to the western wall of the Temple Mount. Archaeologically or aesthetically, that's what you want to see, right? When you build a house, like I say, you want to have your walls kind of parallel. So when they built the Muslim platform, it was parallel to this wall. The step here that I talked about just a minute ago, this step that leads up to the Muslim platform is actually parallel to this wall, the eastern wall. And not only is it parallel, it's 500 cubits away, 861 feet, I believe it is. That's kind of cool. So we do really believe, not I, but in the research that I've done, I believe that step that I showed you really is probably the top wall of Solomon's Temple Mount. And that's pretty cool that you can go see that. The modern day gates are shown here in blue. The only gate you and I can go into is the Mughrabi Gate down here in the southwest corner, close to Robinson's Arch, actually really close to Barclay's Gate. Any other gate, if you're Muslim, you can go in and out of, no problem. You can go out of any gate if you're a Christian, Jew, whatever, but you can only go in one gate, and you go up a long wooden platform, bridge thing to get up there. And I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. You can't see much, but at least I'll show you a picture of it. The Dome of the Rock today, or the Temple Mount today, is a very hotly contested piece of real estate. Shelley was standing at the lower end of the raised platform, and I was standing on the top of the raised platform, and she took my picture. The Dome of the Rock in the background, the Dome of the Chain in the foreground, and there. Notice I'm dressed pretty conservatively. I'm just dressed head to toe in whatever garb. The Dome of the Chain, I mentioned this morning, is probably the location of the porch of the temples. Oh, that's pretty cool. You can go stand there today that other people in the New Testament were not allowed to do. You had to be a priest to be able to stand on the porch of the temple. Jesus wasn't able to do that. The apostles weren't able to do that. But you can do that today because that's likely the location of the porch of the temple. If you go to now from the top of the Temple Mount, we're now down to the bottom of the Temple Mount at the western wall. It used to be called the Wailing Wall back in my early days. I don't see that in the literature much anymore. It's just called the Western Wall. And this is where Jews go to pray, but it's not limited to Jews. The Jews are very lax in letting Christians, Jews, Muslims, whoever come up and pray or do whatever at the Western Wall. I mean, you still need to be respectful of things that are going on, but you can go and touch the stones there. And those stones you're touching are Herodian stones. Herod the Great commissioned those stones to be laid. The first 7 courses, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, these are Herodian stones. So if you go up and you have a prayer slip you want to stick in the wall or whatever, when you go up, you're touching Herodian stones. That's pretty cool. But it's not the stones probably that Jesus and the apostles touched, because there's an additional 19 courses 17 courses underground, which go down 43 feet. If you want to go see those, you can. There's something called the Western Wall Tunnel. And you can walk, they dug out underneath the Temple Mount, the Jews did, and you buy a ticket and you start at one end and you can walk the entire length underground of the Western Wall, and you can see these giant foundation stones of the Temple Mount. One, I think, is 42 feet wide. How they moved that in place, I have no idea. I mean, there's theories on how it was done, but I really have no idea how they would move something that big, and I mean, the weight of that thing had to have been not tons and tons and tons. But you can do that today on the Western Wall Tunnel. So, this morning we looked at the Temple Mount in Jerusalem from over the Mount of Olives, really. But now we're looking at the eastern wall of Jerusalem and Temple Mount. Tonight we're looking at the western wall of the Temple Mount. And you see a bunch of neat things here that I've already talked about. Starting on the very right-hand corner, there's Robinson's Arch. Remember, that's what held the giant staircase that went up to the temple, to Solomon's porch, or the royal stoa, actually. Next up, this is the rubble from the destruction, right here. That's the picture I took a minute ago. This is the giant ramp that leads up to the Maghrabi Gate, where you and I can go to the Temple Mount today. You go through Israeli security here, and they check your bags and everything, make sure you don't have any bombs or weapons or whatever. And you can either go to the western wall, or you can go to the Temple Mount if it's open. In the Western Wall Plaza, this larger area here is for men. The smaller area here is for women. Barclays Gate is right here at the very right end of the women's prayer area. So I was not able to go actually see that, but I do have a picture of that in the book. Wilson's Arch is right here on the left side of the men's prayer area. Wilson's Arch supported a giant bridge. Now remember, on the lower side we had a giant staircase down here at Robinson's Arch, but Wilson's Arch supported a giant bridge going from the upper city of Jerusalem to the Temple Mount. That's what the priests would have used, and the rich people, you know, the haughty-taughty people of Jerusalem. They would use this bridge going over Wilson's Arch that you can see today in Jerusalem, to the very left here of the prayer area. This is the Western Wall Tunnel. Goes the entire length of the Western Wall underground. The step that I talked about, the top of Solomon's Temple Mount wall, the square Temple Mount wall, is right here. It's lined up precisely with the eastern wall of Jerusalem, not lined up with the western wall. So that's a little bit of a clue. Okay. The Golden Gate here is the only gate that was shared by all three Temple Mounts, not the gate that's there today necessarily, but the foundation. The foundations are really the same for the Golden Gate through all the successive Temple Mounts. And the mosque is here, of course, the Dome of the Rock is here. The temple. Now, I'm not going to talk about all the temples. I'm going to talk about just Herod's temple. If you've not had a chance to go out and see the displays in the back, please do so afterwards. And one thing that I have back there is this temple model. There's a guy, Scott Schneider, who he and I kind of do email back and forth now, but he put this kit together, very well done. And you just basically get this kit of 6 million pieces and you start gluing things together according to his very well done directions. Now I changed this. I actually added tile, real tile in here in the women's court and then this priest court back here. And then I put it on a plywood board. So I did a little more enhancements to it than he had in his kit. Another thing that I added was this wall here. This was called the Soreg. And this surrounded the Temple Mount, not the Temple Mount, but the temple complex completely. The Soreg was meant to keep you out. If you're a Gentile, you can't go across a Soreg. It's about 5 feet tall, probably about here. So I could stand there as a Gentile and look over the Soreg and see things going on in the Temple Mount, see stuff going on in the women's court, see stuff going on with the animal sacrifices or whatever happened to be going on. But I could not go in there upon penalty of death. The Jews were very serious about this. So they had a weeding out process, if you will. So the Soreg weeded out Gentiles, kept them outside. Only Jews, Jewish men and women and children could go in up to this area here called the women's court. A little bit of a misnomer. People think that's, well, only women could go there. It's not true. Anybody could go there if you're a Jew. That's the last place the women could go. You can then go up some steps if you're a man and go in through the Nicanor gate into the court of the Israelites. That's where men could go. Jewish men could go. It's a pretty narrow area, but they could go and see the temple rites going on. Take a couple of steps up, I think, and a rail or something, and then you get into the priest area back here where only priests were allowed. And of course, only one person was allowed one time a year inside here the Holy of Holies on Yom Kippur. The high priest was allowed in there once a year. So this is the inscription that's found. A full inscription is the Istanbul Archaeology Museum. A partial inscription is in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem. But it says basically, if you enter past this thing, past this Soreg, you will be killed if you're not a Jew. They were serious about it. This is my depiction of Herod's temple. If you go to the literature, you'll see 10,000 depictions of the temple. Now, some of it we know exactly what's going on. The Mishnah is very clear about the Holy of Holies, the size, the holy place, how big it was, where the altar and the laver. So any of these dimensions, you know, that was kind of close all together to me, but that's precisely what the Mishnah says, are the dimensions of these things apart from each other, okay? But stuff out here, we don't really know where things were back then. So we have to do some educated guesses. The women's court, the treasure chests were likely in the women's court. Remember the widow and her two mites? Well, there's a whole discussion in the book on what mites really are and what they're really not. It's just a translation error, basically, in the King James Version. But the women's, or not the women's, but the treasure chests were in the women's court. The different chambers, the chamber of lepers, wood, Nazarites, and oil were here. When you get to the court of Israelites, where the men could go, and then 3 steps up, I believe it was, you get into the court of priests, and then only priests could go back here, and of course only the high priest in the Holy of Holies one time a year, Yom Kippur. And the Holy of Holies in Herod's temple, completely empty. Remember, the Ark of the Covenant didn't return, the cherubim didn't return. All the implements inside the Holy of Holies were gone. We don't know where they went. So when the priest went in there on Yom Kippur every year, he would sprinkle blood on the stone, just on the foundation stone. Nothing else to sprinkle the blood on. The chamber of hewn stone is where the Sanhedrin met. The Sanhedrin was the Supreme Court of the Jews' days. So Jesus probably had his 4th trial, I believe it was, of his 6 trials, probably in the chamber of hewn stone here. You see that depicted in different places. Some people depict it up here. Scott's model, the model you'll see back there, the chamber of hewn stone is shown up here. That's a little subtle difference, but if you look at the model, you'll see that he has decided that it was probably up on the northern side of the temple. We just don't know. Another cool thing about this is the hell. It's called the terrace, the sacred terrace called the hell, H-E-L. Outside the sacred terrace, there were 2 chambers. A mikveh, which is a bath, so priests could come in and bathe themselves, getting ready for the rituals they were going to do in the temple that day or whatever, or Yom Kippur or whatever it was. And there was also a chamber for defiled altar stones. Remember this morning we talked about that the Maccabees, when they came along, they rededicated the temple in 164 BC, Judas Maccabees. And they tore down the altar stones that had been defiled because the Seleucids had offered a pig on those stones, and that was a no-no to the Jews. So they tore this altar down, and what do you do? I mean, it's kind of still sacred, right? Kind of, sort of. You can't just throw them out in the Kidron Valley, but they're defiled. So what do? Well, they decided we'll store them outside the sacred terrace. We'll store them outside the hell, but we'll still keep them on the grounds of the temple, even though they're outside the sacred terrace. I think that's kind of cool. The foundation stone. If you go in the Dome of the Rock today, if you could, this is what you'll see. The very tippy top of Mount Moriah. This is likely where Abraham almost sacrificed Isaac, where the Muslims believe Abraham almost sacrificed Ishmael. It's where the Holy of Holies likely was. If you read The Quest, the book I was talking about earlier, Lean Rittenmeyer believes he's even found the place where the Holy of Holies sat. I mean, the Ark of the Covenant sat in the Holy of Holies. It's kind of cool, a little chiseled out piece of stone on top of the mountain there. But you can't go see it. And again, when I was writing the book, this is about the only picture that I could find, a black and white picture that I put in the book. So if you've been watching our videos, we talked about, first of all, building up the city of Jerusalem. Next, we talked about building up the Temple Mount and the temples on the Temple Mount. Now that you have that body of knowledge, let's go to the next video and we'll tear it all down with the destruction of Jerusalem.